Halito, which is Choctaw for what's up, I guess, since we're in Kalapuya land, I should say Gamchi Lakwan, but it means the same thing more or less.
What's the shorter one?
Halito.
Halito.
It's Choctaw or Chata. Pronounce it correctly. Greetings. Well, hello and good. Yeah, and then you say shtayu for goodbye, which means stay strong.
Shtayu.
Shtayu, yeah. Okay. How many of you have seen the movie Ethnic Notions? Okay. I'm not going to show it today. But you should definitely peep it on your own at some point if it's available. We can get it out of, we do have it in the library. In ethnic studies, we talk about it. It's filmed by Marlon Riggs, who was a black gay male activist in the 90s and early aughts. I think he died in the mid 90s or whatever. Anyway, one of the things I want to do in terms of talking about, I think I did leave up some of the amendments to the Constitution as part of last week, yes?
Yes.
All right, so I can skip through those relatively quickly unless you want more detailed work, but the idea behind a constitution is that it becomes a legal framework for what goes on both above ground and underground. So if you basically take a justice chess analysis, the Constitution is the above ground rules. But that's going to determine how they're going to cheat. So how they're going to cheat is going to be predictable. And so that's often one of the things that happens, especially when we look at what happens with native nations and Indian law, all right? So the Constitution, so if you want to think of the civil rights movement really begins Civil rights movement begins in 1492. On this continent. Because people's, so the definition, I was watching the President and Secretary Clinton on 60 Minutes yesterday. So when they talk about the homeland, they're talking about North America, absent Mexico and Canada. Now, from an indigenous point of view, and this is a traditional human point of view, it ain't your homeland until you and your people have been there for 100 generations, at least. Preferably 1,000. So that's 2,000 years to 10,000 years, or 20,000 years. Then it's your homeland. Otherwise, you're a newcomer. Well, I got roots here, so yeah.
2,000 years.
2,000 years is older than Western civilization, right?
That's what I mean.
Right. So yeah, there was a whole context of, and that idea is not just my idea, that's humankind, The English-speaking homeland is England, Italians, Italy, yada, 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 right? Yoruba, Twi, Wolof, Tuareg, Kalapuya, Apache, Apache is not what they call themselves, Tine or Shishindi, Hopi. Those folks have all been in their traditional homelands for longer than 100 generations. Sometimes more. So when we talk about homeland security, how is it your homeland? Well, by conquest, which isn't permanent, because empires come and go. Always. It ain't your homeland. You just here by military force. Okay? Just like, the birthers are only partially correct in that by international law, Hawaii is not part of the United States. It's illegally, militarily occupied territory that we made a state. But the Hawaiians didn't militarily resist. So by international law, it's still Hawaiian territory. But nobody gonna take it from the United States. Right? So we count it as a state. But it ain't your homeland. I'm not being non-patriotic, I'm just talking fact here. It ain't your homeland until you've been there for 100 years. So we've been 100 generations. We've barely been here, even as a country, for 200 years. So 10 generations. It's nothing. It's an eye blink. Okay, so civil rights starts in 1492, and the reason I go there as a black Indian is if part of the issue that natives are still dealing with today, you know, the Constitution, remember, defined Africans as 3/5 of a person, not even a whole human being. Women were not, even white women were not considered as citizens then. And natives were basically in this whole, legally, they are domestic, dependent nations. So it's as if you've got France or Germany inside the borders of the United States when you're dealing with the Navajos or the folks that are federally recognized. Now, federal recognition isn't everybody. It's who the feds decide to recognize. It's not everybody there. It's who the feds decide to recognize, and usually they recognize them because either A, they were a military power, or B, they had something the feds wanted. And so we're going to give you recognition so that we theoretically have to pay you money for the mineral rights or the natural gas or whatever it is we want. And we'll recognize you for that. But not because you're a sovereign people. All right, so part of the civil rights movement, the idea of civil rights starting in 1492 with contact. The fate of Native people and African people and other folks are intertwined because we had a model for democracy before quote unquote democracy, Greco-Roman democracy. Okay? There was basically the model of what I was talking about in that Atlantean democracy piece. If you were an adult, that is, if you had successfully gone through and passed your rites of passage, you were a functional adult and therefore had a voice in the government. And that could be at 13 or 14. You were a functional adult. And so everybody had a voice in the government, period. Right? So that's the real democracy, not segregating democracy according to, you know, whatever your preferred categories are, right? So if we jump to, in time, to looking at, we have, you know, when they talk about in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and they have certain inalienable rights that are endowed by Creator, et cetera, right? And among those, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, nice start, right? And if everybody has that and they define that themselves, who are you to take it away? So here's the contradiction. If civil rights struggle begins in 1492, what we're struggling to get back is what it used to be before 1492. Essentially, that's what's happening, right? Because what you'll see is after the Civil War, we had a civil rights bill. We had the right to vote. Black people had the right to vote in 1865. Well, what happened? Well, you'll see. So, as an example, in wartime, this goes back, and we're basically looking at European-style warfare, all right? The general is representing his government. This goes back to the Roman times. They could make decrees. A general in wartime can make decrees based on the battle conditions, based on wanting to win the war, that will help the country win the war. So this whole 40 acres and a mule thing, General Sherman issues field order number 15, giving the islands from Charleston south, the abandoned rice fields along the river 30 miles back from the sea, and the country bordering the St. Johns River in Florida for exclusive settlement by blacks. Each family should have a plot of not more than 40 acres of tillable ground, in the possession of which land the military authorities will afford them protection until such time as they can protect themselves. Now, unless you are farm people, unless your folks came from farm people, like mine did, understand this. In a year, you can grow as much food as an individual can eat for a year on an acre. So he's talking about giving each family 40 acres. So in other words, if farming were the only thing you were going to do, and you had a crop that could make you money, they're giving you not only enough land, not only to feed yourself, but to be economically viable. And the idea of this is, okay, these are occupied territories, we've now won the war, we're going to basically reinforce blacks getting this land, and they're free. Because then they can stay in place. And then they won't make trouble for us. Both sides. Because remember, the Constitution of the United States says that the government has a legal responsibility to put down slave uprisings. Right? But this general saying, okay, this is in wartime. The South has seceded from the Union. Part of what we're going to do is, no, we ain't rewarding you for rebelling. We're going to give this land to these folks who would have to protect against you, but we ain't going to do that now. We're going to basically free them and give them the means of production. All right? So, theoretically, 40,000 blacks given on 40 acres tracts in the area of South Carolina. Sounds good. Later that same year, my man Thaddeus urges confiscation of estates of Confederate leaders and distributing to adult freedmen. Now, notice this term freedmen, because it becomes generally applied. So, for example, indigenous to Turtle Island, by that I mean North, Central, and South America, is the concept of slavery. Slavery was not permanent. So, for example, for the 5 civilized tribes, the lead one being not necessarily their leaders, but the most infamous of them being the Cherokee. Cherokee had black slaves. Now, they didn't believe in chains or whips. And the British, among others, would comment that these Indians don't know how to treat their slaves correctly by allowing them to dress in the way they want, allowing them to marry the chief's daughter, not using whips and chains. The Cherokee basically used their quote-unquote slaves as translators between the tribes and white people. Because if you remember what Thurston talked about, you know, blacks are very familiar with Indians and very familiar with white people and were used as go-betweens. Well, Cherokee said, yeah, there are slaves, there are property, and that's why the Cherokee fought on the side of the Confederacy. They wanted to maintain those slaves. They lost. So part of what happened then within the 5 civilized tribes is they had freedmen, okay, who were black slaves, former black slaves. That's where I traced my Choctaw heritage to my triple great-grandfather, George Washington. Not the president. George Washington is a popular name among freedmen for some reason. But great-grandpa George had 10 kids. So he's on the freedman rolls. So, adult freedmen. So what do you people want? Freedom, land, the lands that were given by the generals and by Stephen were given back to the planters after the war. We want education. So for example, Patrick Francis Healy, the first American black awarded a PhD in history, but he had to go to Belgium to get it. Not here. Du Bois was the first black awarded a PhD, I believe, within the United States at Harvard, or at least at Harvard. So the founding of HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, begins during this time because, again, one of the issues at the time was, all right, you want freedom and you want education, but that doesn't mean, we don't want you mixing. Because at this time also, for a large part, most colleges didn't allow women in them either. There are some that did, but we don't want to mix with you people. So they create HBCUs. And we, of course, want the right to vote because part of citizenship is vote, which means voice. So, for example, then in 1866, Civil Rights Bill passed over President Johnson's veto. Remember, because Lincoln had been killed by this point. Johnson was his vice president. He opposed black suffrage. Suffrage means voting. Civil Rights Bill gives citizenships to blacks and gives them the same right in every state and territory as enjoyed by white citizens. That's what it says on paper. But if this is going to be the rules are going to be predictive of how they're going to cheat, if they're going to cheat. So, meanwhile, white Democrats and police begin race riots. Now, up until 1965, the term race riot in American history meant large groups, mobs if you will, of white American citizens going into predominantly black, Mexican, and native neighborhoods and trashing them. Often with police and fire department collaboration. That is, they'd burn a house down, the fire department's there, and let it happen. And the police would let it happen. Right? So, this is like one of the first places, because obviously this doesn't happen in slavery. Don't need permission to kill your own property. You can, however, destroy your own property and get compensated from it by insurance companies. Not making that up. So, whites killing blacks in Memphis, 46 blacks, 2 white liberals killed, 70 wounded, 90 homes, 12 schools, 4 churches burned. New Orleans, 40 killed, 150 wounded at a convention of black and white Republicans. So, black codes, which is not a secret army. You know, I remember my friends joke, some of my white friends joking when I, walked down the street, and I was raised like to give the nod. Sometimes we'd throw a power fist or just give a nod. What's up? Speak, say something. And, my white friends would, who's that? I don't know, just a brother. And so one of them would say, oh, secret army, right? Right, sure. So black codes are not the secret army. Equal rights meetings held by blacks in various states beginning in May of '65. For example, the last battle of the Civil War was fought at White's Ranch in Texas, May 13th. The black codes were enacted in Mississippi and other southern states, which essentially reinstated slavery legally. Wait, slavery's over. How are we reenacting slavery? Well, see how it's done. Slavery is involuntary servitude, right? You're forced to work for free without being compensated. How does that happen if you're not sold? Well, you're a criminal. Right? And it says that in the Constitution from the Oregon Constitution. You're black and in Oregon, we can arrest you, sell you to the lowest bidder, and you have to work your $1,000 bond off for 3 years, and then you have to leave because they've already paid the bond to get you out. Mississippi, other places, owning land, attempting to owning land, that's a crime. It's not slavery, you're a criminal. So, black codes. So, in some states, any white could arrest any black for any reason. Blacks could be arrested for vagrancy, and refractory and rebellious Negroes could be forced to work on road crews without pay. And these are phrases of art, refractory and rebellious. So, for example, you might have seen me wear a t-shirt that refers to myself as uppity. Uppity means you think you're equal. Well, actually, we think we're superior in some respects, but equality will stand for, right? So, uppity Negroes were basically ones who could be considered refractory and rebellious, and they could be forced to work on road crews without pay. Vagrancy. Now, when I talk to you about the sundown laws that existed that are on the books in Veneta and Springfield, understand when we get to this time period in the 1920s with a Klan being run out of the University of Oregon in Eugene. The sundown laws in Eugene don't refer specifically to race. They refer to vagrancy. Okay? If it's not legal for you to buy a house inside the city limits, what are you doing in the city limits after dark? You're a vagrant, and you could be subject to arrest. So as long as you're outside of the city limits, we don't care what you do. If you're inside the city limits and you're not conducting legitimate business, you could be subject to arrest. Okay? And so the Eugene laws that are essentially sundown laws are applied to vagrants. Well, who are vagrants? So, blacks owning land became a criminal offense. South Carolina, blacks had to get a license to work outside of domestic and farm laborer categories. So, for example, the first election in the South, this is under military occupation. Election commissioners refused to count 1,400 black votes. The military, because we're still under military control, so Alexandria is basically across the river from Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. should be understood is in the South. It's below the Mason-Dixon line. It is clearly a southern city, and you can definitely tell that when you go there today. Clearly a southern city. Right? Military suspends local elections pending status of clarification of the status of the freedmen. Wait, it's already been clarified. What else do you need to know? Constitutional amendment and civil rights bill. All you have to do is certify folks. So again, once they lay down the rules become predictive of how are they going to cheat. All right? So when we look at what was happening, for example, in nation building within Iraq, who gets to vote? Do we limit vote according to which sect of Islam you are? Whether you're a Christian, whether you're this, that, and the other? How do we decide that? Same problem we had with Syria, or have in Syria. Assad's part of a religious minority. Do we have democracy? How, one person, one vote? How does that work? How does the Constitution work? Do you have one? So in Reconstruction, what that technically is acts of Congress to divide the South into 5 military districts under command of the generals. There were elections ordered for constitutional conventions. So basically this is at the state level where the state has to be reconfigured from a slave segregated basis, a racially segregated basis, to allow for the election of black elected officials, judges, police, etc. Because at the time, because if you notice the context of any white could arrest any black, who can a black sheriff arrest? Yeah, they would tend to segregate it, right? A great-grandfather of mine was a black sheriff in all-black town. I believe it was Argyle, which is outside of Houma. I think I can Google map it somewhere, but it was an all-black town at the time. So the military has to order the status of blacks to be changed in many cases. So Reconstruction, for example, starts with voting. Constitutional conventions basically attempt to rewrite the Constitution of Southern states, so allowing all those officials, black policemen, jurors, officials, eventually lawyers, because the lawyers have to be trained at HBCUs, right? Judges, senators, congressional representatives. Now, what is always amazing to me at this time is that you have these black congressional people who are elected straight out of slavery, who are able to travel to Europe and converse in multiple language with Europeans without having learned those languages in school. And compete on an equal basis. Like, how do they get that? And that's part of the reason why I designed the class, because we're going back to 12,000, because how do you explain how freed slaves are able to speak multiple languages without learning that in school? Because they already had the capacity. And were practicing it in secret. So for example, P.B.S. Pinchback from Mississippi, Hiram Revels, a U.S. Senator from Mississippi, Blanche Kelso Bruce, another senator from Mississippi, Robert Greener, who was a college professor of mental and moral philosophy at the University of South Carolina, librarian, taught philosophy, and assisted in the departments of Latin and Greek, mathematics, and constitutional history. We have to look at these things as strategic. Being able to break down multiple languages, particularly the languages that are forming the theoretical basis for Western civilization. Okay? In order to break the rules, you have to know what the rules are in the language that they're in, the original language. Admitted to the Supreme Court of South Carolina in 1877 and the Bar of D.C. Received his doctorate in law and another doctorate from Howard, and was at the law department at Howard, which is an HBCU in D.C. So, Civil Rights Bill of 1875. All persons within the jurisdiction of the United States shall be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the accommodations, advantages, facilities, and privileges of inns, public conveyances on land or water, theaters, and other places of public amusement, subject only to the conditions and limitations established by law and applicable alike to citizens of every race and color, regardless of any previous condition of servitude. Now, for example, these little racial code words, like, besides uppity, grandfather clause, not Santa Claus's grandfather, but you could vote if your grandfather could vote. If your grandfather was a slave, you can't vote. Right? So when we say something is now grandfathered in, well, you don't have the qualifications, but you've been doing this so long, we'll just let you continue doing it without the qualifications. It's another context for grandfathered in. So, as an example, previous condition of servitude, grandfather clause is one of those. There's another one where we have, my dad used to say little comments like, no comments from the peanut gallery. I said, peanut gallery, what's that? The peanut gallery is the, let's see, peanut gallery. Also known as, it's cable, I can say this, nigger heaven. Okay, so last two rows of the balcony section of a theater. Usually a separate entrance to the theater, movie theater. So for example, might have existed at the McDonald Theater, because certainly McDonald, whether or not he was a Klansman or not, he allowed Klan-friendly movies to be shown at McDonald Theater. And also what's known as the Eugene Theater, which is now where the Hult Center is. If you ever go to Ashland, the theater that's on the main drag there, okay, there is a separate side entrance that used to be the blacks only entrance.
Is that, it's on the right side? Or
Yeah, it's on the right side as you're heading south.
Does it go upstairs?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I actually haven't been in, I haven't actually gone through that entrance.
They used to have pictures of Klan.
Yeah, right.
On the side as you go up. I remember looking
Right.
at them like, wow.
Yeah.
It's got this in the entrance, huh?
So basically, the reason, if you remember what I was talking about last week about original position, okay? You don't write a law for something that ain't happening. Okay? So for this to be there in 1875, despite a civil rights bill in 1866, and they still got this going on, there's a reason why they're writing this law to reinforce public accommodations. Now, it actually doesn't do anything because this is a federal law, but the states are operating their own thing. This is where that whole question, the other racial code word of states' rights, comes from. So, uppity, grandfather clause, states' rights. Where that comes from is the state has the right, no matter what the federal law says against discrimination, the states have the right to enforce discrimination. And that's usually what they're talking about. Okay, Constitution allows that. Okay, broadly, you can have, you have to follow federal law, but you decide, for example, who's qualified. So, for example, the different laws about If you become a felon, you lose the right to vote? It's the state that decides that. Right? So states' rights. The state's right to discriminate, no matter what the feds say. Okay, so civil rights on paper. We got black politicians and policemen and legal rights. So it sounds good on paper, but when I go to a restaurant and theater, they won't serve me or let me in. Where do I go to complain when a white policeman arrests me because I won't leave a restaurant? So example, the peanut gallery, nigger heaven. So there is a standard within the law. Used to be the reasonable person. That was, the assumption was the reasonable person was a reasonable white man. Wasn't a reasonable, so what was reasonable to a white man might not be reasonable to a white woman for obvious gender reasons, especially if you have legalized discrimination by gender. What's reasonable? Okay, so part of that standard, of that legal standard of what you consider reasonable is, for example, things that we have with sexual or racial harassment. Okay, it is the call of the person who feels victimized for most things, not for things I'm about to show you, because I didn't show you different layers of isms yet, right? Okay. So, what is the reasonable black person standard? What would Yeshua do? All right. So, what are you? So, for example, in Reconstruction, so I just laid you the framework, the historical framework of what Reconstruction is, from the legal and military point of view. We're dividing the South, which lost the war. The slaves are free. But we know the South ain't just a good loser. They're going to have to be reinforced, and reinforced by military force. We're going to have constitutional conventions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We've got this legal framework and backed up by military force. Y'all going to play ball whether you like it or not, but they're going to find ways to get around it. So that's on the macro side. Individually inside the culture, not to say that there is a singular monolithic black culture. We diverse, because Africa is diverse. All right? What if you're reconstructing a sense of nationhood within a nation that rejects you? How do you accept yourself? That's part of the question. You need a spirituality that resists rejection. Now, I don't think I define it in this particular slide, but let me define spirituality. So spirituality equals a lived sense of connection to something greater than yourself. Then in that so spirituality is independent of religion. A religion a set of prescribed exercises to develop spirituality. So spirituality can exist without religion, and religion can exist without spirituality. This is from Naeem Akbar, in case you wanted to tune into his body of work. Okay, so you need a spirituality that resists rejection. So, how and what do you start with? Given that for the first 78 years that this country existed, black Africans were not allowed to practice any kind of spirituality at all. So a third of them were Muslim, and the ones who were Christian or Jewish were not allowed to practice Christianity or Judaism. If you also were part of the local tribal religions, etc., you definitely weren't allowed to practice those, except within secret. So you start with an image. A liberated people control the images which depict them, or control the images which affect them. Just like the Chinese proverb of a picture is worth 1,000 words. Who are you? What symbolizes us? Okay? And a liberated people control the images which depict them, or control the images which affect them. They choose them. They are not imposed upon them. I'm just raising this as an issue because of, well, there are a variety of things. Not sure I'll go there just yet. So, at least in secret among their own people, based on their own experience, the reasonable person's standard goes like this. So, there are 5 things being reconstructed, and this is among black folks. An African culture modified by the experience in America. So 5 things. You need to build a healthy culture. That's a minimum, if you're going to simplify it. A basis for egalitarian access to anything that is equal, unrestricted. Language, psychology, spirituality, and cosmology. Education, means of production, skills, tools. So egalitarian access to language skills, psychological skills, spirituality, cosmological skills, education, means of production, skills and tools, economics, politics, history, goals, and common purpose. Now, yeah, it's more than 5 things, obviously. But would you agree, or you can even feel free to disagree? Those things, minimally, you need for a healthy culture. Independent of what's going on around you. Okay, so we're essentially trying to rebuild what happened before slavery. Actually, what we brought here 2,500 years ago, before there was Western civilization. This is essentially what we brought as explorers. All right, so expanding on those. So, basis for egalitarian access. Can anyone of any gender expression, I want you to note that term, just not being politically correct. Gender expression. Harriet Tubman led combat troops into battle. She was in a heterosexual marriage, but she never produced kids and never was hanging out with a husband. She was always at war. We don't know about her love life. But, theoretically, is she getting married for a cover? Who gets married for a cover? Politicians, right? Or oppressed people who have a different, other than heteronormative gender expression. And the reason I bring that up is if in Africa in the 20th century there are 12 kinds of marriage among the tribal nation that fielded all women or women military commander led armies. Okay? 12 kinds of marriage, only one of which we'd recognize as heteronormative. You only evolve that social form if you accept different gender expression. And if this is going on in the 21st century, in the 20th century and the 21st century, then it was going on before Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. 2. So, gender expression. So, can anyone of any gender expression attain any position if they display leadership qualities? That's 1. 2. Do you train people to accept leadership in any form it comes? That's the other part. For Native people, for African people, for Chinese people, actually, if you go back to before Christianity and Western civilization, you have white women leading combat troops against the Romans in Ireland. Queen Boudica. It's where we get the English word bodacious. Her husband, the king, had been killed, but she led combat troops against the Romans and won.
What about Jonah?
There's that too. Joan of Arc, you mean? Yeah, right. Okay, so the model exists. It's not just can you allow it, but will people follow them without tripping too hard? Both things need to exist. Languages. So, not languages plural. Notice that. African psychology, African spirituality. So, spirituality is where I personally fit in the universe. African cosmology, where we, and we is in quotes because it's not just human beings, embody. I tripped somebody out the other day. There's a group of students that are pro-life. So they asked a standard question, and she says, well, when do you think life exists? Or life begins? And I said, before conception. She wasn't expecting that. I said, yeah, where did we get abortion technology? She didn't know. I said, the same people we got cesarean sections from, the Egyptians. It's 5,000 years ago. So 3,000 years before Christianity existed, assuming you're Christian with its pro-life belief. Okay? They believed they couldn't release a technology without assessing the moral impact on society. The reason they had abortion technology is they believed that the soul wears a body like you wear clothes. Therefore, if you kill the body immediately after conception, you are not affecting the soul because the soul is the real human being. The body is just clothes. That will disappear. Right? So that's not just the Egyptians. That's, there's a line from the Upanishads. Never the spirit was born. Spirit shall cease to be never. Never was time it was not. End and beginning are dreams. Birthless and deathless and changeless remains the spirit forever. Death has not touched it at all, dead though the house of it seems. The body is just a house for the soul, like clothes. It's not affected by this. Okay, so from that point of view, life begins before conception and continues after death. Guess that was just too deep for lunchtime, but I'm just saying, right? So the idea, that's part of African cosmology, not just African cosmology. But you will see references to it. That particular worldview. So, community education, control of means of production, surplus labor, Any of you had economic theory or studied economics? Well, do you know what surplus labor is? This is surplus labor. Okay? What this is a representation of if you can get your own water, your own firewood, grow your own crops, take care of yourself physically and your family, then what do you got to trade? What do you need anybody else for? You don't. Now, if somebody else has a skill that you do not, you use this symbol. So it doesn't matter whether it's what natives would call frog skins, these frog skins, greenbacks, or cowrie shells. Money is surplus labor. Okay? So that you can trade this symbolic object with other people, and they can either perform the skill or basically, use that as an exchange, a means of exchange. Well, that's ultimately what money is. It's a symbol of surplus labor. Now, in our society, because you can't go down to the river and get your drinking water, particularly if you live in Salem, because Salem is drinking what, oops. We get our water from, Eugene Springfield gets its water directly from the Mackenzie River. Right? We do. Our drinking water. So there's nothing up there, and then, the water is cleansed and all that kind of stuff, but it's pretty pure. And then our sewage gets flushed, gets sent to a sewage treatment plant, which then discharges it into the Willamette River, and the Willamette River is used by Salem as drinking water. Anyway, all I'm saying is we don't have the ability now to go and get our own drinking water, our own firewood, our own stuff. So we now have an interdependent society where we have to pay for that stuff with our symbolic surplus labor. Right? We've gotten to that point. So in terms of understanding how surplus labor concepts like that work in an economy. So economics is basically the study of what is value, what is valued, who is valuable, and who is valued. So it's not just money, though in Western society we think of it as just the flow of money, but not necessarily the flow of ideas. We don't think of wisdom as necessarily being valuable, except where, wisdom that comes from a book or a college. Like, that's not the only wisdom there is. And sometimes people with degrees don't know crap about living. They don't. I'm here to tell you, even though, I got degrees. There's some things that can't be taught in a book. By common sense, to the degree that sense is common anymore. Anyway, the idea of basically somebody accumulating a lifetime of wisdom and knowledge, are they valued? Are your elders valued? Are your young people valued? Are your creative artists valued? How are they valued? What kind of values do they exhibit? So that's part of economics too from an African point of view. It ain't just money, it ain't just physical stuff. It's also knowledge is a food. Do you waste food? No. You nourish yourself, right? So that's part of the economics as well. Who has access to all that? Then, politics. Politics is a science of power. Who has it? Who doesn't? How do you lose it? How do you gain it? What kind of respect do you get? What kind of respect do you lose? How do you conduct yourself? Okay, so this is the science of power and governments. History. So, for example, that proverb that we talked about, the hero is the teller of the tale.